Hey, good afternoon. Today we're going to talk about a particular curriculum objective and how it relates to Bloom's taxonomy and all six levels of those. We will unpack a particular objective from the Virginia Standards of Learning, and we will discuss this objective from each of the levels of Bloom's taxonomy and determine a way to assess a student's mastery of the objective for each level. So the objective that I have selected to be assessed is the English SOL 12.4, which reads that students will use evidence from the text for support when drawing conclusions or making inferences. Making inferences can be one of the most difficult things for a student to figure out how to do. But hopefully by the time they've reached the 12th grade level, they are making inferences fairly easily. And so the main objective or the main aspect of the objective that we want to make sure that we accomplish for the upperclassmen, the 11th and 12th graders, is that they're able to apply those same skills in the more challenging texts that the 11th and 12th grade curriculum bring, but also so that they can use those same skills for drawing conclusions and making inferences out in the real world, where some of them may, have careers that require them to make inferences on a regular basis, or even just basic critical thinking skills, since making inferences is definitely one of the higher level critical thinking skills that make adulthood a little bit easier when you can master those critical thinking skills and be able to either read something and take the text evidence that you have and make conclusions from there, or just take aspects of the environment that you are and draw conclusions based on what you're seeing. So the first level of Bloom's taxonomy is, of course, knowledge. And the definition of this particular level, this is the most basic level. If you think of Bloom's taxonomy in the image of a pyramid, knowledge is going to be your base. You cannot meet the other levels of Bloom's taxonomy unless you have mastered the first level knowledge. Otherwise, it will crumble. Much like a pyramid, if it doesn't have a solid base, it will crumble. So the definition of level one of knowledge is it's just simply rote memory of skills. So this would be like just basic recall, being able to identify the correct term that matches a definition, being able to recite information back, basically regurgitate information. And I would suggest that we assess the making inferences objective just by checking for prior knowledge first to make sure that the students do have a solid existing competency on drawing conclusions and making inferences. Even at the 12th grade level, we do not want to assume that students have mastered this. We do still have some students that struggle with this. So we want to make sure that before we go into the more complicated levels of Bloom's taxonomy, we want to make sure that our students have a good grasp and a good competency on what it means to draw conclusions or make inferences. So the strategy that I would like to use in doing this, or I would suggest using in doing this, is just a simple Kahoot quiz on making inferences. So you can tell this is a little bit of an elementary type Kahoot, but again, we're on the basic knowledge level of Bloom's taxonomy. If you are an elementary educator, you are probably going to live on the lower few levels of Bloom's taxonomy anyway. So again, this is just to check for background knowledge and just to make sure that the students know the gist of how to make an inference. So you can see this consists of 7 quiz questions, and elementary all the way to seniors love a good Kahoot game. They get so competitive with these. So this usually whenever I use a Kahoot, they stay engaged. They love it. So you can just see that it's got 7 questions. And it's requiring the person to make an inference based on the clues that are provided. So she has a diaper in her hand, spit up on her shirt, and a bottle warming on the counter. She is a mother, probably, is what they would come up with. And so all of the examples are like that. She is yawning with puffy eyes. She is tired, is what the students would say. So this just kind of will, I guess you could say, waken up that prior knowledge and that existing competency that they have of making inferences. And through that Kahoot, it also helps the teacher to understand like who might need a little bit of extra help with identifying this properly and understanding the concept properly. The second level of Bloom's taxonomy is comprehension. And the definition for this one is it's just simply the ability to translate, paraphrase, interpret, or extrapolate material. So again, this is still a very basic level. If you're envisioning that pyramid, this is just going up one level. So it's still very important to the rest of the structure of that pyramid, because even if that second layer starts to crumble, the whole structure is going to fall. So this is still a very foundational level of understanding a concept. It's still a very elementary level. It doesn't require a lot of critical thinking skills with this. It's just being able to repeat back a concept or put it in their own words. The way I would suggest assessing making inferences on the comprehension level of Bloom's taxonomy is to determine if the students are able to determine who makes inferences in everyday life outside of a classroom. So basically, I want to get the students to kind of think outside of just reading a text and making a guess about what a character may be thinking or what may be happening behind the scenes in the situation. I want them to look outside of the text, outside of the classroom, and apply that same knowledge of making inferences and drawing conclusions to the real world. Who would be able to make inferences outside of the classroom? And I love using Padlets, so I would suggest for the strategy for this one would be just to make a Padlet. Just a very basic Padlet, making inferences. Who can you think of that would have to rely on making inferences outside of the classroom? There's not really any right or wrong answers to this, because honestly, everybody has to make inferences at some point in their lives. But kind of the direction that I want them to go would be like an investigator or a detective, maybe police officers, doctors, people that in their careers or in their life outside of the English classroom, they have to gather clues and combine those clues with the prior knowledge that they have, and then make a conclusion from that, which is essentially what we're doing when we're making inferences from the text. So that's kind of the direction that I would want them to go into, and I would hope that a lot of the responses through the Padlet would go in that direction. And if not, of course, the discussion would kind of lead to that as we move on throughout the lesson. All right, the third level of Bloom's taxonomy is the application level. So we're getting a little bit more challenging with each level we move up. If you're still envisioning this pyramid, we're still moving on up that pyramid. We're still towards the bottom. So again, if this part of the triangle were or the pyramid were to crumble, only the small part at the bottom would remain. Everything else at the top would topple. So it's still fairly important as far as foundational in mastering a concept. So the definition for this level 3 application is just the capacity to transfer knowledge from one setting to another. So again, we've gone from the basic, can you identify or can you figure out based on these clues what this person is doing, to how can you use inferences outside the classroom? And now we're going to come back to another setting. And so with this one, we're going to assess, we're coming back to the classroom, but we're going to go to a much more challenging text. So again, we're moving up that pyramid of knowledge. We're moving up that pyramid of difficulty. So we want to go to a more challenging text for the students to see if they can still apply those same skills from the very basic text that we gave them on that first level with the Kahoot to something that's a little more challenging. So for this, the strategy that I would suggest using for this is a discussion board through Canvas or whatever learning management system your school uses. We use Canvas. So I would set up a discussion board and have students read a passage. And I'm going to go ahead and pull that up. I would have them read a passage from Macbeth. And I've got to scroll down to the quote that I want to use. But I would want them to read this quote from Macbeth and then make an inference about what they think Lady Macbeth is saying. I must have skipped it. I'm sorry. Okay, this one right here from Act 1, Scene 7. I have given suck and know how tender it is to love the babe that milks me. I would, while it was smiling in my face, have plucked my nibble from his boneless gums and dashed the brains out had I so sworn as you have done to this. So when I'm teaching Macbeth, my students are always appalled when they get to this scene. And when that moment clicks in their mind of what Lady Macbeth, is actually saying when she says this to Macbeth. So before we went through this passage together, I would want the students to read this on their own and come up with their own inference. What is she saying here? What does she really mean? What is she feeling? What are her emotions right now? What's her motivation? She's speaking to Macbeth. The students would have some context at this point of Lady Macbeth trying to convince Macbeth to kill King Duncan so that he can become king. So what's her motivation here to say this? Why is she saying this to Macbeth? Why is she so extreme in her example here, or her simile here, or metaphor that she gives here? Why is she so extreme in that? So through that discussion board in Canvas, I would be curious to see what the students think about that. And of course, whenever I do a discussion board in Canvas, I always require them to reply to at least one or two other classmates as well, just to get some good discussion going with whatever topic we're looking at for the day. So now we're at level 4, which is the analysis level of Bloom's taxonomy. So at this point, we've kind of crossed that midpoint of this pyramid that we're envisioning. And so now we're into the more critical thinking skills of Bloom's taxonomy. These last 3 layers are typically reserved for your secondary level, probably 6th grade. Your more advanced 6th grade students can start to do some analysis. But for sure, as they move on up in 7th and 8th, and then definitely the 9th, 10th, and 11th grade levels, those students are ready for this type of thinking. So the analysis level of Bloom's taxonomy is the ability to discover and differentiate the component parts of the whole. So they've got the whole part, in this case, of making inferences. And so they need to be able to discover and then differentiate all the component parts, the steps, the individual steps that it takes in making inferences. They've been doing this skill. They've been learning this skill of making inferences since the latter part of their elementary years. But now when they reach this level of analysis, they need to start breaking down, how am I coming to these conclusions? Like, what are the individual steps that I'm having to take mentally to come up with this conclusion or this inference after I've read? So in order to assess the analysis level with making inferences, I would have students analyze the thought process of making an inference. So analyze the text evidence piece, like what specific pieces of text evidence are you using, or are you, I guess, highlighting or focusing on to then lead to that conclusion or that inferences that you came up with. The next step, of course, is the prior knowledge piece, the things that we already know. So what specifically did you already know, and how did you already know that information that then allowed you to take the text evidence and make that inference? And then there is the third part of it, is that connection between them, taking what you see in the text combined with what you already know, and then coming up with your inference or hypothesis as to what's really going on, or what the motivation of the character is, or whatever the situation is. So for this particular strategy, I would do small group instruction discussion with some text annotation. So I would have, a piece of paper with if we're still using that Lady Macbeth quote, I would have that quote printed on the sheet of paper. And I would have the students either pair up or in groups no larger than 3, maybe 4. But I don't want a whole lot of people in the group because it's a small piece of text and there's not a lot involved to it. And this will be, a 5-minute activity. But I want them to bring out their highlighters and their pens and pencils, and I want them to annotate the piece of paper that I've given them with the text on there. I want them to highlight the text evidence, the specific pieces of text evidence, the words, the phrases that they zeroed in on as they were thinking about what the character is really saying. And I want them to highlight those particular areas in the text. And then I would like for them to, on the side, in the margin of the paper, to write down their prior knowledge. Like, what was it in their prior knowledge bank did they pull up to be able to make that connection between the pieces of the text evidence and what they already knew, to come up with the idea that Lady Macbeth is just trying to let Macbeth know and help him to realize just how serious she would be if she had promised something to him. That if she had promised to bash her baby's head against the wall, that she would do it. She's just that committed to a promise that she made. So I would want them to really annotate that text and analyze and break down the two, or really the three main components of making inferences and how they came to that particular conclusion. The fifth level of Bloom's taxonomy, again, we're moving on up that pyramid. We're almost at the top. So we're really getting into the high level critical thinking skills. Some of your lower grade high school students may not quite be here yet. The advanced students may be, but the general consensus of high school students at this age or at this level, especially the 9th and 10th graders, are going to struggle a little bit with synthesis, since this is a much higher level of critical thinking. So this part is where you're going to weave component parts into a cohesive part. So basically, we've taken apart the process of drawing inferences or making inferences and drawing conclusions, and now we're going to put it back together. So we've taken apart those pieces in level 4 with analysis, analyzed them, figured them out, and then we're going to put them back together. And the way I'm going to assess this is that I'll have students create their own writing sample that requires the reader to then make an inference using text evidence. So it doesn't have to be long. The Lady Macbeth quote is quite small, quite short. So something about that length, but I want them to think like, to be the author in that moment, and to write their own or create their own writing sample that has text evidence that would lead to the reader making an inference using the text evidence that they provide. And the strategy that I would use with this would be independent practice. This would be each individual student writing their own sample on their own. So it would be complete original work. And then I would use this that they've created to lead us into the 6th and final level of Bloom's taxonomy, which is evaluation. So this is going to be the very tip top of the pyramid, the hardest level, the highest level of critical thinking out of all of these 6 levels. And so the definition for this one is just the ability to be able to judge the value or use of information using a set of standards. So they are evaluating how good this is. Like, does this follow this set of standards? Does this meet the standards that are set before us? And we would do this by having the students evaluate the effectiveness of their classmates' writing samples through a blind exchange. So in the previous level, we had the students write their own writing sample that requires the reader to make an inference. So they're not going to put their name on it. So it would be, again, a blind exchange. That's our strategy, would be that blind exchange. So they don't know whose paper they're reading. And they're just going to turn them in to me. The teacher will shuffle those pages up and then just pass them back out to the class. So they don't know whose writing sample that they're reading. And so as they're reading those writing samples, they're evaluating how effective their classmates were at providing good text evidence for the reader to make a clean inference that's kind of on target with what the author wanted the reader to think. Okay, so that allows the students not only then to break apart. Again, this is the higher level critical thinking. They're breaking apart in level 4, breaking apart the pieces of making an inference. Level 5, they bring them back together and kind of create their own type of inference or type of writing sample that requires making an inference. And then they're going to evaluate each other's effectiveness in creating those writing samples. So here are the references that I used. Of course, our textbook, and then the Kahoot, the No Sweat Shakespeare, and then the Department of Education for the Virginia Standards of Learning. Thank you so much, and hope you have a great day.